Are you running that?
Yeah.
I feel the biggest change that we saw was the massive wildfire of the year 2000. And it just changed everything, basically. It changed the infrastructure of the facility. It changed how wildlife interacted in that environment. It changed our role as managers and scientists at that field station, because so much of what we did was either everything was directly oriented to the fire, either the effect on our water system and our fences, or the interest in research which came about. And there was a lot of interest in research from a forestry perspective, from the tree ecology, so to speak, vegetative ecology, rangeland ecology, and Jim Peak did a lot of work in that arena, both with pre and post fire data to look at for comparison. And the stream itself, lost a lot of its riparian cover, and that whole dynamic changed. Flows changed with runoff. The stability of the airstrip had to be dealt with. There was so many things that fire affected, and it really, from our personal carnivore research perspective, I felt took us out of a forefront situation and directly comparable to what was going on in the Yellowstone system with the work we were doing, to not having the time anymore to really look at how wolves, for instance, were affecting the mountain lion, the cougar situation.
Can you talk about how that fire affected you both personally?
Yeah, it was high drama for us, and we'd been through fire before at Taylor Ranch in 1988, the same time Yellowstone was going through its big fire episode. We had a 100,000 acre fire that was primarily to the north of Big Creek, but was a threat to Taylor Ranch, and we spent a few weeks, I won't say under siege, but under the protection of the Forest Service with that fire positioned just to the north of us. I don't remember what that complex was called at that time, but it was a major fire. Golden Creek fire. But it was nothing like what we experienced with the Diamond Point fire and the big fire of 2000, which involved multiple fires merging together, us having to evacuate the field station and going to our nearest neighbor 21 miles away, and then having the opportunity or the misfortune to experience a real firestorm once we were at the Flying Bee on the Middle Fork of the Salmon. It was high drama. It was scary. It was, in a way, life-changing to go through that sort of an experience, and something that people who are living in remote situations today are typically not given the opportunity to experience.
I think for me, the fire was the first time I really felt like, this is what wilderness is about. We have no control over this environment or what's going to happen to us. We don't have the option to just fly out or be rescued, call in a helicopter. So that was quite a different feeling. We'd always been comfortable in the wilderness and not afraid of what might happen, or that we might be in danger in the backcountry. But that was truly a sense of knowing that we had no power over nature, and nature was going to do whatever happened, and we were going to be the victims of it, whether it turned out well or not well. So that was certainly a big enlightening perspective for me.
And it was a level of stimulation that I don't think I've ever felt before, particularly when we were at the Flying Bee, and we had a dozen or so people that were all in the same situation, and we knew that our survival was dependent upon our emergency plan, implementing that plan, and our instincts and how we responded at that moment to what was going on. And it seems like the bear report post massive fire evaluation that the Forest Service did indicated that what we experience very few career firefighters go through, which is being in the middle of a firestorm. And it's
what was that like? Can you talk about that?
yeah, it was scary, basically, and it was a new experience. So you just didn't know what was going to happen next. You were reacting at the moment, and Holly and I were in separate situations. She was out in a great big alfalfa field with a large herd of horses and mules, and some women that were less physically capable to react to that situation. And I was ultimately trapped in a shop with two guys that had a similar responsibility to. That was our fallback point, was to go to that shop, and that we didn't really realize that it would be to protect ourselves from a horrific wind, because there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 100-mile-an-hour wind that was accompanied with a fire front as it overwhelmed the Flying Bee facility. And no, it was just totally high drama and putting out spot fires. And then as we all regrouped after the big fire front had run its course, it was one of firefighting and structural firefighting. So it was intense drama, and a great big extension bridge that spanned the Middle Fork of the Salmon. It pulled out of its foundation that was built in 1950. So it had gone 100 years without, or 50 years without experiencing that type of wind before. So again, it was just simply high drama, adrenaline rush.
Then immediately following the fire, the adrenaline rush disappeared and was quite a depressing sense. There was a lot of fighting among the Flying Bee employees, and just a sense of depression where we were looking at the devastation of burned areas that previously we never would have imagined could have burned. Lush riparian areas, and we're finding dead and dying wildlife. And so that was really hard to deal with. And we had a sense of melancholy for quite a while after that. It just felt like all this beautiful area that we lived in was now blackened and not so nice. And I vividly remember thinking, well, I know as a scientist that fire is good, and I kept telling myself, remember, fire is good, but it's kind of a not in my backyard sense. Yeah, fire over there is good, but right where we lived, for a while, it was very hard to see the beauty in the area, and we had to actively seek out beautiful things, a new flower or the color of the new shrubs coming up in the riparian in the fall. It was difficult, and then even like we would fly out from the wilderness and come to places like this Wallowa Valley and see all these green trees, and it just seemed incredible that there were slopes of green trees. So our whole perspective was altered by our environment, living every day in an area that had burned trees and burned forest, that green forest actually seemed quite unusual to us. So that was very interesting to see that our perspective could change so much.
And I think it brought about this element of scale. And, controlled fire, small scale burns, 15 to 20,000 acres, which is still quite a bit, compared to 250,000 acres. That's just devastating. And I understand historically that there was a lot of stand replacement for massive wildfire in the Salmon River Mountains, but feeling it, seeing it directly, you realize, wow, that is a major event. It's not something that seems in the proper scale of wise management, that it was basically too much. And it did change my view of wildfire, definitely.
It changed my view too, and I think in a way, we knew from our personal experience this was not normal. And at the time, we talked to the Forest Service, and I actually asked our forest supervisor if there was an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. and talk to politicians about fire, that this was not a normal situation.
And this is in the year 2000.
This is before everybody started realizing, you know what, climate change has changed things, and that wasn't normal. But at the time, the Forest Service was still promoting this view that fire is always good and fire in wilderness should always be allowed to do what it does. And it would drive us crazy to see any new fires in our area, and the Forest Service would publicly say, we're going to let this burn because it's beneficial to the environment. And 75% of our ranger district had been burned in the last 20 years. And there was no way that additional fire was beneficial to the environment, but that was just the language of the day. And so it's interesting now for us to see, it's well accepted now that these fires are not normal and they're not all beneficial and improving things. They're different because of climate change.
Do you think that fire suppression played a role in its extent and severity?
You know, I think that it probably did. I think there was some disease occurrence in trees. There was another factor that I just really think whether it's climate change, a climatological cycle or shift, that dryness factor was the biggest variable. Yeah, I mean, we came in again the old Idaho years. In 1985 was the last year that we were involved in supporting the lookout, going up the Rush Point Lookout. And at that time, that was still manned, and there was forest fire observation activities that were pretty intensive in that time period. It was transitioning from lookouts being manned in the mid-'80s to aerial surveillance. But it was still done with the intent of, if there's a fire out there, we probably need to jump on it and put it out. So there's this whole mantra, there's the physical change that's occurring related to climate, and then there's the sociological aspect that, well, no, like Holly mentioned, fire is good, doesn't matter the scale. And so we came out of this thinking, well, controlled burns are really a good thing because they can help temper that out of control scale aspect. It was quite a learning experience for us, really, and I do think that we were in a unique situation to feel it, absorb it, and then convey what we'd witnessed. And but we never really had that opportunity outside of writing some published articles and also what we put as a fire story in our book. Maybe smaller scale, but I'd kind of forgotten about you contacting the forest supervisor about that, and that was kind of the mindset that we had at that time. It's like, oh my gosh, we've experienced something that maybe is a view into the future, looking into a crystal ball of what's going to happen around the West in that year of 2000 and shortly thereafter. So
It sounds like you adapted though.
we did adapt, and we had a scientific responsibility, we felt, to, okay, we've been through this, we have our personal views on this, but now what's really important is to monitor change. And we kind of buckled down into that role, I think, and it was great to see all the other interests that came about from that. Stream ecology, forest health,
And even stand replacement.
Yeah.
I think that, I don't know if anything's going on now with any research on that, but the Douglas fir forest that was there before might not ever come back and look the same. And so again, there's that dynamic relationship of ecological conditions that you can't necessarily predict that something will be altered and then come back the same as it had been before. I mean, that's often the case but when you have a changing climate, I know Katie Kavanaugh was doing some research early on after the fire, and for the first 2 years after the fire, we had drought summers, and the little Doug fir seedlings that from the trees that actually put out cones as they were dying, the little seedlings came up in the spring, but they didn't have enough moisture to survive through the summer. So we were not seeing reproduction, and we lost a lot of that potential for reproduction on some of the trees because the summer conditions didn't allow for that quick rebound on the forest.
Yeah. And there's, I don't know, there's again this unusual blend of technological capability and old ways of viewing nature. And, like I think about the LiDAR flights that occurred and, latest imagery capability that was being applied to the burnt swath of Big Creek. And yet, on the other hand, there was our basic functioning happening with the loss of our water system. And all of a sudden we had this huge availability of firewood, but everything was black, and it wasn't as nice to deal with. It's finding a dead tree here or there, and adding that to our larder of firewood needs for the winter. So it was a strange contrast, and the dynamics of change, the contrast of time, is something I think that's really interwoven into that site, that place. And
There's also a new source of danger living at Taylor Ranch. Jim mentioned the BEAR group, that's BAER, it's a Forest Service analysis post-fire about conditions, and they reported that the drainage that flows in above Taylor Ranch was severely burned, and that there was a high likelihood in the next 10 years post-fire that there would be a massive debris flow and a high likelihood, I think they said a 50% likelihood of risk to
human
lives. So that was a little intimidating to hear that from the Forest Service. And at one point we were going to have some faculty come in and talk about post-fire research. They decided it was too dangerous for them to come in, so it was just Jim and I that stayed there in the dangerous situation because there was a thunderstorm, and it was a possibility that there could have been a debris flow.
Flash floods.
But we actually had a safety plan for the possibility that we would have a debris flow that could separate the two sides of Taylor Ranch, and we had emergency gear placed up on the hillsides on both sides that had blankets and food and
communication
flashlights
devices
and two-way radios in case we had to suddenly evacuate and run up the hill just to avoid being wiped out from a big flood event. So every time we had a thunderstorm, we were always checking the stream and seeing how the situation with the water. Was there more water than usual? Was there less water than usual? Because either one of those two could be a problem. If there was damming up above, we might not see any water in the stream, which would be probably more risky than seeing too much water. So there was a time period that we were kind of on high alert, and we had to let our students know, that we had these protocols in case we needed to evacuate people.
But it also stimulated a research interest that put us, I think, into at least in our 3-decade association with Taylor Ranch, the peak of activity post-fire, which occurred from maybe 2002 or 3 up until 2007 or 8, roughly, where there was this intense interest, and that place was humming at absolute capacity. The field station was. Researchers from Idaho State, federal government, Idaho Fish and Game, University of Idaho. There was just a lot going on, and a lot of student involvement as well because of that. So, there was a good component that came from that big event. But putting it all in perspective, it kind of boils down to what we were bringing up earlier, that wilderness is dynamic, and that whole episode, that whole time period, I think captured that dynamic aspect.
Mhm.
Yeah, it sounds like wilderness sometimes changes or is dynamic in ways that are unanticipated, or that perhaps is too much for us, or it kind of exceeds our expectations as far
Mhm.
as
Yeah,
what changes can happen.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You know, and people could say, well, what if grizzlies were restored back in that system? How would that change everything? And I think the tendency is to think, oh well, it would be more dangerous to camp here or there. To me, that is so small scale compared to what a massive wildfire will bring about change-wise. And it's just a little dot, a speck of sand compared to that scale of wildfire. So,
Well, in our
mm,
own research, it was interesting to see, like Jim said, we were in the middle of our research project when the fire hit, and one of the things that we found, and again, it was more subjective than having a research plan and a data set, but we were studying cougars and wolves, and we found that the wolves benefited from wildfire and the cougars were adversely affected. And we attributed that to the different um, the different
lifestyles,
life uh, life
survival style,
strategies
yeah.
of the two species, that wolves lived in packs and had very, very large territories, and the cougars were had individual territories. So when most of the Big Creek drainage burned, the wolves could take that large pack and move to another drainage that hadn't been burned. But the individual cougars didn't have an option to leave their own territory to go to another one. And so we had cougars that were starving um, and
Killing each other.
killing each other and high stress environment. And the wolves seemed to do just fine. The elk from the Big Creek Winter Range went to the Chamberlain Basin, and that's where the wolves spent the winter. So they actually had twice as many elk concentrated in a non-burned area, and the cougars had very little to eat. We actually even documented them killing
Moose.
moose that were starving to death, because the moose also did not move. They stayed where they had been for previous years, and there was no food because the riparian was burned. So we found some fascinating relationships, um, but in the big picture, it adversely affected our research ability because we had commitments at the field station. Um, but what we learned from fire was fascinating, and we would have never been able to know that if we hadn't had the fire occur in the middle of our research.
It kind of blew up the scale of what the questions we were trying to answer in regards to our wolves influencing cougar stability and how they went about their lives. Because, like Holly said, the wolves went a long ways away, and rather than interacting with the cougars that were in our study area per se, were probably interacting with a whole different population. And we just couldn't get on top of it logistically. And then you combine that. I think if we wouldn't have had the responsibilities at the field station, we might have been able to adapt to that scale, but it still would have been a huge challenge, the way movements had occurred. Let's grab a bite to eat.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So one thing that we didn't talk about that I think is important to address with Taylor is the I don't know how to describe a legacy of learning, the student aspect. And I would say now, looking back on our accomplishments at Taylor, I would have to say influencing young people and stimulating young people to pursue careers in some aspect of natural resource management. I would say that was our hallmark. And the relationships that we built with those students, we've got many great lifelong friendships that came from that. And, it was very rewarding to see that. I mean, it was cool to bring the place around for functioning in a living history manner with the mule team and all that stuff. But when it's said and done, the real important take home was the opportunity for students to develop their own knowledge base and have their own experiences and then share those experiences with others was important.
I would agree with that. I think that for me was also a primary sense of satisfaction that we could challenge students but also help them figure out a success, and we just saw so much growth. And that age class is the age that they're going to be really growing and learning anyway, but I think that wilderness environment and having self-sufficiency, and really we just saw so much change within a summer with students in their confidence, their self-confidence, and feeling like, yeah, I can do this. And we just loved seeing those changes in the students, really growing and blossoming after their summer at Taylor. And for us, not having children, they were like our kids. So we've been to a lot of weddings, and we keep track of babies being born, and it's just been really special for us to see the careers of the students that we were involved with.
Yeah.
That ties into one of my last questions, which is, what kind of future do you want to see for Taylor?
Well, I think that multifaceted learning opportunity is huge. That involves a high involvement with students. Students are the key, both undergraduate and graduate. Obviously, there needs to be faculty engagement there. Whoever's on site hopefully can stay long enough to absorb a lot of those elements that we've talked about with the local history, the natural history, and and understanding why the place is so special. So it's this mixed bag that at the base foundation level is student learning opportunities at various levels.
One of the things that some of our students told us was that they learned so much in their summer as student interns, as undergrads. They would say more than what they learned in class, but I think what they meant was the pieces came together.
Yeah.
In the field, when you're actually working science, all the pieces you learn as book learning make sense. And so I think that's an important role for providing students that opportunity to connect academic learning with the reality of how that fits into natural resources and nature. And I know one of Jim's big pushes also is that it also should be an adventure for students.
Yeah.
That when you go to the wilderness, it shouldn't be lots of rules and you can't do this and you can't do that. It's a time of exploration for students and a time to learn what you can and can't do. And so I think it's important to give students as much leeway as they can handle, and if they need guidance to help them succeed, then provide that. But it's a fine balance to maximize them gaining personally what they need to gain in that kind of environment. But I think it's such a unique environment that University of Idaho has a real gem in a place to help develop students in a way that can't be done anywhere else.
Yeah, and the future of Taylor, it's dependent upon, funding is a big part of that. And it's, we've had visits with UI leadership, and the current dean, Dennis Becker, who's very motivated to help secure that, which is great. Um, it's hard to get over the hump and really get that established to where there's a block of money, a donation that produces enough um, interest through an endowment to be able to fund basic functioning plus provide unique research and educational opportunities. And I think that it's going to happen. It's just you don't know exactly when, and it's got to take all the stars to get aligned properly. And it could be we're at that point in time, but it's really good to see a core of folks that are willing to keep that that place at the forefront, keep it alive as something that's going to extend into the future. And I think that as long as there's that nucleus, we're in good shape looking ahead. And when we were involved, and some others, Janet Pope and Ed Crumpy and Jim Peak and a variety of other folks who have connections to Taylor Ranch, envision this Friends of Taylor, which was this core of people that would be capable of some financial help, but primarily would share a vision which would ultimately lead to this endowment. And I just think that it's one of these times everything's going to come together, and then that place will be self-supporting and could really develop to its full potential.
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say on the research side, it seems that it takes a couple core faculty who really have a commitment to do something in that kind of environment, and it's not an easy research environment because it's not accessible by vehicles. But it seems to me like it's time to do another kind of a group meeting with potential researchers who would like to talk about, what are the best purposes and the best ideas for research at Taylor. Things have changed. We've got fire, we've got global climate change is now thought in a very different way than the last time there was a group of faculty that got together and said, well, where do we see the best focus for Taylor? And it may be an individual person with their own personal interests, or it may be a core group that says, this would be an ideal focus for research. But to get at least 2 or 3 researchers, whether from U of I or ISU or
Wherever.
National, Forest Service, USGS, to start putting together a program. It seems like once something gets started, it grows. But right now things have kind of died out and there's not a core research program going on, and it needs to be started back up. There's still some research going on in the area, but I don't know how much integration among faculty or of looking at some of the past data that might be available to expand on. But I think the research is another critical component. It's not just for education. The wilderness is a great place to do research, and there's already some good, solid data sets and publications that have come out that either could be built on or expanded in different directions. So I'm hoping to see a research program as well, and just like an endowment for education, to seek out some base funding. I mean, even if it's just to maintain monitoring, because there is some monitoring still going on, and monitoring is important, and it's usually the last thing to get funded. But those long-term data sets are what field stations are known for, and there's some of that at Taylor. There could be more.
Yeah. And there's a good core of faculty still active. Colton Baxter from ISU was wonderful for us to work with, and he's still engaged there, and it'd be nice to expand his engagement. Brian Kennedy, another faculty from U of I, was quite involved shortly after the fire, it'd be nice to get him re-stimulated, and whatever that takes, if it's another big NSF grant or whatever, there needs to be a push to do that, because those guys, they already have a feel for the place, and they would be very beneficial in bringing in the next cohort of folks that would follow in their footsteps. And maybe it's in a different field, different discipline.
And they're both very collaborative too.
Yeah, they're both very collaborative.
So
and,
it could be some people who are not very directly connected that could collaborate and really create some unique results.
And I guess personally, I would like to see a continuation / completion of the archaeology work that was done by Dr. Frank Leonhardy, and he had graduate students in there that completed their thesis requirements. But there's a lot of loose ends that didn't get tied together. And I think that's an awesome learning experience for students too. Those field archaeology type camps. And to me, that was a surprising high point scientifically in our Taylor Ranch experience, was that work looking at how the sheep eater Indians lived their lifestyle in that piece of country.
As managers, you witness just a constant stream of comings and goings, and
Yeah.
different people, scientists. I'm curious to know what you think stays with people when they leave Taylor. What do people take out with them?
As far as the researchers,
No, I mean
There you go.
something like deeper. Like most
Yeah.
people only spend a little bit of time at Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what you think people, what sort of experiences or relationships or whatever it is that people bring out of Taylor with them into their everyday lives.
I think just like how we felt, I think a lot of people, even if they're just there for a short time, get this sense of immersion, direct connection with nature. And, we just hear so often how much people enjoyed being at Taylor or in the wilderness there. And I think it's that absence of the everyday things that keep us all busy. When we see people come to Taylor Ranch, and it often takes a couple days before they kind of slow down. And you can see the new people are just, what time is it? Oh, what's my schedule? I need to do this or I need to do that. And that becomes a slowness where you can think deeper, think longer, create connecting relationships with people and with nature without the everyday hassles. So I'd say
Refreshing, reinvigorating type of an experience. I personally have often thought something that is not realized at Taylor is the potential for a writer in residence or writers in residence, because it's the type of environment that really stimulates creativity. And we obviously wrote a book after we left, but I can remember thinking so many times, having our daily diary in front of me and thinking about a topic or a story, that I could be much more creative if I were doing the same at the site, on site, listening to Big Creek, just hearing all the sights and sounds and smells of that drainage. It's invigorating.
And I think that goes the same for research too.
Yeah.
With that opportunity to slow down and think about things, I think the creative thought process for science is there as well.
Yeah.
That sitting in an office in Moscow is not quite the same. I mean, you can look at data and maybe get more insights, but being out in the natural environment really allows for that creative thought, whether it's science or art.
This is kind of off tangent a little bit, but I know one thing I thought of a few times, particularly our last few visits to Moscow, is how similar that must our experience was to Dave Lewis when Dave Lewis went to Boise, and he looked at those buildings. He hadn't been there in 30 some years, ever since he was based at Fort Boise as a Army scout, and in thinking, oh my gosh, how do all these people make a living? Why are all these people at this one place? It just seems odd. Then fast forward to us going to Moscow and just seeing everybody hustling around and looking at their computer screens. And even then in '09 and early 2010, cell phones were starting to come around, and it was like, man, you guys have just lost touch with reality. And it just seemed like such an odd concept that, wow, what's happening to mankind? And it's kind of repeated itself over time. And for Lewis, it was seeing whatever the name of that hotel was there in Boise that he'd visited in 1881 or something like that, and then saw it again in the late 1920s. And oh my gosh, it's the same place, but look what's happened around it. There's a city around it now. And so, I don't know. I guess that's, to some degree, a little bit of an unhealthy thought, but maybe it's a wake-up that we as people, through having those refreshing experiences at sites like Taylor Ranch, can perhaps look at our global, our world situation a little bit differently. Not get so wound up and bent out of shape over situations that we either can't control, or we should take a different perspective in how we address those problems. And I'm thinking mostly environmental type issues there.
Yeah. Students are, especially students of science, are so immersed in data now. And
Yeah.
there's a lot less familiarity with the sources of data.
Right.
How to render data from the world.
Yep.
And I feel like
Right.
Taylor is a great place where you can be immersed in the sources.
Yeah. That's true. It's fundamental. Yeah. It's very.
And kind of the big picture, because data is usually about a small thing, and you can say a lot about that small thing that you study, but if you don't understand how it fits in the big picture, you might misinterpret the data that you have.
Yeah. But I don't know. There's still hope, and you work with these students, and you get to know them, and you really see that people don't change from one generation to the next. They're affected by all their influences that are somewhat external, and Taylor provides an influence that I think is very wholesome for the future. And environmental awareness, scientific understanding, historical perspective is also very important. And it's just, I don't know, there's a lot of hope, and that place is one of those nodes of hope.
That's great. What about any? I'm thinking now about using some of those pins and georeferencing stuff.
Yeah.
Are there any memorable animal encounters?
Oh boy. Yeah.
that
Too
stick
many.
out? Yeah.
There's a lot. There's a lot. And some of them had happy endings, or oh my gosh, wasn't that amazing? And others were close calls. Thinking about having a pack string and encountering a moose on the trail, and the horse backing back through the pack string and causing a big mess. Yeah, I mean, there's just a number of things.
We have many of them tied with our research. In the summer, we were taking students to wolf dens. So
Yeah.
almost every wolf den encounter was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And camping around wolves, or researching wolves and cougars as well.
We'll have to spend another part of a day coming up with points on maps, because it's something that's a cool idea. Cabin Creek has a lot of stories and nodes with it. And the pictographs down by Soldier Bar is another one that's stimulated a lot of thoughts, dialogue, and it created experiences.
Didn't Taylor have a resident bobcat for a little bit?
We
So
did.
That was, that was Gary Kohler. Had Khmer.
Khmer the bobcat. He was a character. Yeah, you didn't want to leave any thawing meat out on the counter, or you're going to end up in a battle to recover your elk roast.
Which we did a couple
Yeah,
occasions, I
yeah,
think.
yeah. Had to involve the dog once. But yeah, pack rats, numerous pack rats, especially after the fire.
Bears breeding in the garden that we can hear in the middle of the night and
Yeah,
sounding like some old man being beaten or something, that you sort of want to lock the door and go, I don't know what's going on out there, but lock the doors.
yeah. And packers coming up to the house in the middle of the night after having a big pack string wreck in the gorge and losing loads and having a few animals drowned, and harrowing experience. And there's a ton of things. And a lot of them are in the book that we wrote, but a lot of them are another book and or documentation like what you're doing, Jack, with the points on the map. I think that's a really cool idea. Click on that and get multiple stories over time.
Yeah.
Well, some ours, but other people have got great stories too. And if you could just coalesce that around a site, Low Bar Basin, Cabin Creek,
Yeah.
Soldier Bar.
I was thinking another site that would be good related to wildlife is across from Taylor Ranch are the benches.
Yeah.
Found the benches, and in late November, the bighorn sheep rut primarily right there, and so you can hear them butting heads from the cabins, and there might be 60 or 80 bighorn sheep up on the one bench up there, and you can go up and hang out with them.
What does that sound like? The headbutting.
It sounds like chopping
Bang!
wood.
Yeah, it is.
It sounds
wood
like a big
chopping.
thunk.
Yeah,
So when you
Thunk.
hear it,
yeah.
it's like, oh, somebody chopping firewood.
There's a reverberation about it that it takes horn against horn to create. But
But
one of the big observations I thought was cool was when we saw, and Mike Schlegel was with us, a Idaho Fish and Game biologist. We watched through a spotting scope this fairly large mountain lion moving in on a group of sheep, and they just bunched together like muskox. And then one of the young rams went out towards the cat with this blob of bighorns behind it, and the cat turned and took off. It was confused by that, but those are things that are not well documented. But being there all the time and looking at this one hillside, like Holly mentions, all the time, you see just a variety of different things. And recognizing rattlesnakes are a big part of that system there. They're there, you see them all the time. They can be startling at times, but they're also pretty fascinating. And the fact that the rattlesnake research that was done there determined that these snakes are going from down low to up to 7,000 feet elevation, and they're traveling pretty good distances in the course of their activity time of the year, and then all going back to a common den site. And knowing that was going on was pretty fascinating. But that's one animal that I don't care to do radio telemetry on after having done some of it, because it's an unprecise thing with a Yagi antenna and moving in.
And you're close, but you
Yeah.
don't know which way to step.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're lucky, you hear them rattle. But yeah, some great experiences.
And a lot of interesting encounters when we were trapping wolves, and so those were always
For radio
fascinating.
calling.
We had telemetry on our traps, so in the middle of the night, if we were trapping near Taylor Ranch, we would know the trap was disturbed, and so sometimes just one of us would go out to check the trap. That was a little unnerving at night to go out and wonder, is there going to be a wolf in this trap, or is the whole pack around? We really didn't know for sure.
Or is it a non-target like an elk that's got the trap on its foot?
Or a raccoon.
Yeah, or a bobcat. Yeah, that had to be done carefully, for sure. I think that there's a whole nother aspect of living there that is important to document, and that's the role of aviation in that backcountry, in that wilderness, in that field station, because it really made the logistics possible and doable. And aircraft use in wilderness is a point of controversy. But in that particular case, it was so blended into that backcountry culture. It was critical for the capability to use that area, to educate and research in that area. It was a very big part. And I grew up, my father was a pilot before World War II. He served in a B-17 group in World War II. And he was really into aviation. And he always really wanted to see me become a pilot and get into flying. And I might have done that, except for it seemed like whenever I was getting close, there would be somebody who we knew who was highly experienced who had a mishap. Not that it happened frequently, it didn't, but it just happened enough to make me realize you want to be operating in there as a pro, not as a beginner. So I was always hesitant to get a pilot's license, but I still really valued aviation. I think I became pretty aware and competent of aviation capabilities, different aircraft, different conditions. And I value that association. That's something that I view, I guess, with good favor looking back on it, is all those aviation-related experiences. And some of them were a little bit harrowing. We certainly had some of those, with no visibility and getting near dark and pretty much relying on that pilot sitting next to you and their judgment, because this is before GPS technology. It's pretty much them having confidence in their altitude, their compass, and their capability to fly straight and keep level when you didn't have any visibility. But they did it, and here we are today. So I guess that's the testimony to it. That many good pilots, Arnold Aviation, McCall Air Taxi, and folks from Pullman and Moscow were good as well. That those ones that we flew with week in and week out, Arnold Aviation, Doris is from McCall Air Taxi, I'd put them with the best of any pilots on the planet. But safety is always important with that. And it's something that Morris Hornacher reminded us of a few times, I can remember.
Yeah.
Did you have a close call?
Well, we had, when we did the grand opening of the DeVlieg cabin in '04, we had some precarious flying, people coming from Moscow, and the weather just wasn't that cooperative. And then, those situations, do you go ahead and try and fly people out now, or do you just stay another day and wait out this storm? And his inclination and advice was always wait. And by chance, I think that we did tend to postpone some flying at that time, and another well-known pilot from the Stanley area did crash that particular day. So it's always best to err on the side of caution, no matter what your experience level.
And if the pilot's not comfortable, you just go do whatever they want,
Yeah.
no matter what you thought you had scheduled.
Yeah.
So it was interesting that we often did have days, like we might be waiting in Cascade to fly back in to
For
Taylor Ranch.
4 or
and
5 days.
as difficult as that is to just hang out and do nothing day after day, that's just part of the backcountry living, is you go with when the weather allows you to fly, and when it doesn't, then you're not going anywhere.
Well, you do develop a very close bond with those aviators, be they the pilots or the folks working for the aviation service. I mean, extremely dependent on it. And yeah, I think that's something that's easily taken for granted, but it's an incredibly unique and valuable skill, the capability to go safely in and out of those mountains, day in and day out.
Yeah, I'd love to interview some of those pilots for this.
Yeah, Ray Arnold's a good one. Mike Doris is a good one too.
Mike Doris, I've heard, yeah.
Both are.
Yeah.
Both, and Walt Smith, who's flying for Arnold's now, he's an outstanding pilot. We used to consider him the young pilot, but he's probably now halfway through his career, and he's extremely good.
Yeah, I think that covers it.
Good.
If there's something else or
Well, we need to talk about those points at some. I think you're
Yeah.
onto something that's pretty cool for that,
Sure.
and I think it's highly valuable. For some reason, I'm just thinking on those terms, and I think if we got some maps out with a little bit of time, we could give you some good stuff and reference you to other people that would have
Okay.
some good stories.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.